Growing up in California, I would hear my older brother and his friends talking about these abandoned towns that were scattered throughout the desert. They would always go exploring in abandoned buildings and towns, and when they would tell me their stories, it would always sound so cool. This is why my family wasn't too surprised that as soon as my friends and I could drive, we began doing the exact same thing. For the most part, we would visit places that my brother had told us about, but there were a few occasions where we would see something online and decided to be the first ones to check it out. For the most part, this led to some pretty cool stories to share when we would all hang out on the beach. But there was one occasion that always haunted me and my two buddies, Dylan and Mateo. The three of us had heard of this ghost town that was out in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and we thought it would be a great place to visit for the day and go exploring. And when a weekend came up that all of us were available, we packed our cameras and began our trip. The drive took about 3 hours, and the last hour of it was particularly barren. There were almost no signs of life outside of the occasional gas station and rest areas. Finally, we made it to the town, and immediately you could tell it had been abandoned for years. Most of the houses were single-story homes, with most, if not all, of the windows smashed out, and a lot of them even had their roofs caving in on them. We spent the first hour or so just walking along the road and peeking into the houses from the outside. Most of them were locked, so we didn't want to break in. However, there was one building that caught our eye. At the end of one of the tiny side roads leading off of the town, we noticed there was one house that had tarps covering up broken parts of the roof. Out of curiosity, we approached. It almost looked like someone had turned it into a makeshift home. I think that was when we all got a little freaked out, as we all simultaneously realized that we might not actually be alone in this supposedly abandoned town in the middle of nowhere. Mateo calmed Dylan and me down, and we all collectively figured that maybe someone was squatting there, but the odds of them still living there seemed small, so we slowly approached it to check out what might have been left behind. As I approached the window, I made sure to listen closely for the sound of anyone moving around inside, but from what I could tell, it was vacant. I pressed my face against the glass, and through the fog created every time I exhaled, I could see all of the torn and tattered furniture that sat alongside a heap of trash left behind by whoever had been staying there. I signaled to Dylan and Mateo to come to check it out, but just as they got to the window, I noticed something that told me we had been wrong. Sitting on a small end table beside the couch was a handgun of sorts, and I could tell even from that distance that it was the cleanest thing in the house, meaning someone was inside. That was when we all heard the sound of vehicles approaching. We couldn't tell what kind, but it sounded like dirt bikes or maybe ATVs. Dylan and Mateo turned to see where the sound was coming from, and before I could join them, we all heard a yell come from inside of the house. A man had come around the corner into the room and was standing directly across from the window. His yell caused all of us to jump, and we began running away as fast as we could. We ducked through the yards that connected the abandoned house and did our best to stay out of sight as the sound of vehicles got closer and eventually passed us in the direction of the house where we were running from. We all made it back to the car, which was parked about a half a mile down the road. As we began to turn around, we could hear something that truly terrified us. Those vehicles were back, and it sounded like they were heading our way. Mateo quickly turned the car around, and we headed home as quickly as we could. When I walked inside my house, I was relieved to see my brother so I could tell him what had happened to us. That was when he told us that he had heard of the ghost town we visited, and they never went there because it used to be a known drug den. The police had apparently busted multiple meth labs in those houses over the past decade. A group of friends and I had always wanted to go camping in the Nevada desert, so when we all finally got the opportunity to do so, we all jumped at it. It was a 3-day camping trip, and we made sure that we had more than enough supplies to deal with the extremely hot days and cold evenings. The first night was indescribable. I mean, they always say that the sky over the desert at night is something of wonder, but I had never seen that many stars in my life. We spent most of the next day walking around. We went on a decent hike that lasted about 2 hours before returning to camp and getting our food going. From that point on, we just read our books and enjoyed some music that we played through a battery-powered speaker that we brought with us. As the sun fell in the sky, we welcomed what we expected to be another beautiful night, but we were sadly mistaken. We all sat beside the fire as we let it get smaller so we could see the stars better. When my friend Francis began to tap me on the shoulder, I asked him what he needed, and instead of telling me, he just pointed off in the distance. Now we were miles away from any civilization, so you can imagine how surprised we were to see what appeared to be another person standing about 20 feet away from our camp, just staring in our direction. We got everyone else's attention, and by the time they were all looking, the figure began to walk closer to us. That's when I decided it might be best to call out to them, so I yelled hello and asked if we could help them with something. They didn't respond at all. They just kept getting closer. At this point, they were right at the edge of our camp and continued to walk through. We all stood up from our seats and kept asking them if they were okay and if they needed help, but there was no answer. They didn't even look at us as we tried to talk to them. It was a grown man who slowly made his way right through the middle of our camp and then continued walking. That night, we decided to stay up because we weren't sure if they would come back or not. But around 2 a.m, the wind began to kick up and our fire ended up being blown out. If it weren't for the stars in the sky, we would have been in total darkness. We spent the next 2 hours waiting for the sun to come up, and after about 20 minutes of darkness, our worst fears came true. We could see the figure that we saw before lurking around in the distance. We all stayed close to each other, still unsure about what he wanted. There were a few occasions where the man got close to our camp, but he just seemed to be aimlessly walking back and forth. It was terrifying, but he oddly didn't seem to want anything to do with us. As the sun began to rise, we all began to pack up our things. Though nothing happened to us, there was no way we could do another night out there. As we were packing our things, I kept looking out into the distance, wondering if I would see the man who had been stalking us, but there was no sign of him anywhere. We left the area without a trace of us being there, and haven't talked about going back since. When I was 27 years old, I decided I wanted to be adventurous, and one of the things that I always wanted to do was go on the Appalachian Trail hike. So I decided to plot out a 4-day section of the hike and ask my dad if he would drop me off at my starting point and pick me up 4 days later at a spot that I designated on the map and GPS. He was more than happy to help me, and before I knew it, my hike began. Days 1 and 2 were just fine. I was making good pace for a while, and it was actually looking like I might reach my pickup point a day early. That would have been fine though, as I would just camp out and take the day to relax and get a good night's sleep. Halfway through my 3rd day, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I assumed it was just some animal and nothing for me to be too concerned with. But after swearing, I heard shuffling behind me. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. That was when I noticed what looked like a bit of fur poking out from behind a tree. As soon as the animal poked his head out to look in my direction, I could clearly see the head of a mountain lion. He noticed me looking at him and took off running off the trail and into the woods. I was confused and concerned as I never encountered a mountain lion before, and I was essentially in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't stand there for long though, and I decided to keep my pace and continue walking through the trail. Sure enough though, about 5 minutes after I continued walking, I got that feeling again, and I just knew that I was being followed. I decided it might be safer for me to end my trip sooner than later, so I stopped on the trail and quickly pulled out my map. I could feel the two eyes staring at me from beyond the tree somewhere. I just couldn't take the time to find out which one. As soon as I looked at my map, I found the nearest pickup location and called my father. I think he could hear the panic in my voice because he told me to hurry to the parking lot and that he would meet me there. I had a 4-mile run ahead of me, but I did my best to pace myself. I had to take a few small breaks to catch my breath, but as I got closer to my destination, that feeling of being followed slowly faded. By the time I had gotten to the parking lot, I could see my dad's car. I quickly ran to it and explained to him what had happened. We both made our way home and tried to forget about the whole thing, but it's something I still can't quite shake.